Rachel Notley, leader of the official opposition in Alberta and also leader of the NDP, held a press conference this afternoon in which she advocated for more authority and decision-making for the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Alberta. That's Dr. Deena Hinshaw. So I'm going to talk to Lorian Hardcastle, the Faculty of Law, University of Calgary, about that, what it means. And so welcome to the interview, Lorian.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, look, I interviewed you back in November, and we talked about this. Under the Alberta Public Health Act, she has two broad powers. So she advises the government, and that's the one that Dr. Hinshaw claims is her primary and only responsibility. But the act also gives her the power to act independently when there's a pandemic on, when there's disease present, I think is the way the act describes it. And she has abdicated or refused to fill that role. Have I got that right?
Yeah, so the way that the government has structured it is that she doesn't actually need the government's permission to issue a public health order in response to communicable disease. The way the government has seemed to have structured it during COVID, though, is instead of her on her own initiative issuing those orders pursuant to her legal authority, what instead seems to be happening is she is taking them recommendations. The cabinet's COVID committee is arriving at what the ultimate public health restrictions will be. And then the order comes from her and is signed by her and cites her authority under the act, even though it apparently is a decision that's coming from cabinet. So what we're seeing is a bit of a disconnect between what's in the act and what's happening in practice.
And also the fact that because it's filtered through the government, then politics, and I think it's incontrovertible now. Nobody can argue that politics have distorted Alberta's pandemic management. But
that's right, and yeah, and so when you hear the Chief Medical Officer of Health speak, it's difficult to know if what she's saying reflects the science or if she's relaying a message from government that reflects a balancing of politics, economics, social factors, and public health. And so the public isn't really able to get to that scientific, unbiased information that doesn't have that muddying with the politics.
Now, Notley is calling for two other things, which are new and based on findings in Ontario. Could you tell us about those, please?
Sure. So she's calling on the government to actually make the Chief Medical Officer of Health even more independent. And this is something that came up post-SARS, that public health officials should have more independence. And it's something that came up in Ontario as part of an inquiry that was done into COVID in long-term care. And those recommendations are first, that the Chief Medical Officer of Health should have greater independence, for example, by being able to speak directly to the public on those public health recommendations. So to clarify that is allowed. And there's reasons why the Chief Medical Officer of Health here has said that she can't do that. She has cited cabinet confidence. So basically that her recommendations to cabinet are confidential. She's cited the fact that she's merely an advisor. So one thing would be to just clarify that she can have that information channel directly to the public. And there's other ways that they didn't touch on, but that could enhance her independence. For example, she could have a fixed term appointment. She could report directly to the Legislative Assembly instead of the Minister of Health. And so there's all sorts of individuals that have independence of governments that we could draw on. We could look at the powers or the relationship between the government and somebody like the Privacy Commissioner or the Auditor General. And then the second thing that Notley was recommending that comes from Ontario is having a science table. And so this is a panel of experts that is completely arm's length of government that acts as the voice of science, the voice of expertise in providing information to the government and the public about COVID-19.
Yeah, that seems to be a prominent theme of late. Scientists and doctors and nurses are criticizing Dr. Hinshaw and the public, Alberta Health, for not following the latest science. For being, I think, as Dr. Kimberly Prather, who's a world expert on aerosol transmission of COVID-19, put it, called it bureaucratic inertia. And I assume that having an independent science table that's familiar with the latest science is a way to get around bureaucratic inertia.
I think it is. I think it's a way to get information directly to the public on what the evidence is. And then the public is able to recognize if what the government is doing is different than the science. And they can apply that pressure to the government to follow the science. And if the government isn't willing to follow the science, at the very least, they can take additional steps to protect themselves and their families.
Yeah, the personal risk assessment is something that comes up over and over again in my conversation with people in Alberta. It's how do I determine whether my kids are at risk, I'm at risk, my family, my spouse is at risk. Not only is the information not always available or it's muddied, but often the public health orders. I mean, you and I did an interview last week about poorly written public health orders. And but I guess that just comes down to competence or better decision making by the government that gives the Dr. Hinshaw more time to prepare those public health orders. But my goodness, this is such a mess at the moment.
It really is. And the public health orders, the problem was really the urgency around them. This is a government that waits until we're in a dire situation before they act. And then we get rushed incomprehensible policies. But at the very least, if the public health orders don't reflect the science, as you say, people could at least do personal risk assessment and take additional precautions to protect themselves if they had access to that science. For example, if people had information about aerosol transmission when the government was still waffling on that issue, they might have taken additional steps to protect themselves in the workplace or to avoid contacts with other people.
Lorian, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me.